Welcome back, everybody, to the Omniverse Comics Guide podcast. I'm your host, Eric Anthony, one of your hosts. My other host is David Molyneux. How you doing, buddy? But for this week, we have a special guest with us, one of my favorite creators. I talk about him often, legendary writer, a teacher, a musician. He's the imagination behind the creation of the DeMultiverse, which is on Kickstarter right now. Check it out. It's none other than JM DeMatteis. How are you doing, good sir?
I'm doing great. I'm happy to be talking to you again. It's been a while.
It's been a while. Yes, we've had a number of conversations that were on the podcast prior to the Omniverse, which was the Cave of Solitude. So check those out. We'll probably post those on our website as well so people can have them in the archives. But we've had some really great conversations, and I'm looking forward to talking about the second phase of the DeMultiverse that's happening right now. Like, people who are tuning in, they know you from the classics that you've done, but now you're in the midst of making an entire multiverse of your own. What's happening with the Kickstarter? Catch us up on what's going on.
Well, for people that don't know about it, I should back it up and tell them the secret origin of the DeMultiverse. I've been doing pretty much since the beginning of my career, since Moonshadow. I've in comics, I have divided my time between doing the Marvel and DC characters and doing my own creator-owned work. And in recent years, I paid a lot of attention to Kickstarter because I'm always looking for new venues to get that work out there. And what always appealed to me about Kickstarter was there's like this wall between creator and audience that's just dissolved. It's just you and the work and the audience, no one else in between. So I was very, very intrigued by and interested in that, except it just seemed like a lot of work. And I just know myself and I know my nervous system. I knew I couldn't handle it by myself. Long story short, my friend David Baldy, longtime writer and producer of television, we got to talking about Kickstarters one day, and he said, well, I'll do it with you. And David has something I don't have, which is a shrewd business mind, which I have never possessed and will never possess. And so we got to talking, and basically he said, well, what ideas have you got? And I've always got like so many ideas floating around. It's just the nature of the beast, and sometimes those ideas will get out in the world in like 15 minutes, and sometimes it takes me 20 years of developing them before they get out in the world. So I pitched him like 4 ideas, and he said, why don't we do all of them? So David's idea was to do 4 number ones, launch all 4 of the books, like basically 4 pilot episodes. And I thought that was great because how often do I ever get the chance to get 4 new ideas in the world? So David created this imprint for us called Spellbound Comics, and we launched the DeMultiverse. The 4 books are, I'll try to be quick because I know we have a lot to talk about. Layla in the Lands of After with my old friend Sean McManus, which is a fantasy about a girl trapped in the afterlife, trying to get back to her body before the window between worlds closes. Godsend, which my one-liner is Jack Kirby meets Philip K. Dick meets The Matrix. The first issue was done by my friend Matthew Dow Smith. Matt is busy with some projects of his own, so he couldn't come back. So for the second issue, we have Scott Koblish. The third one is a supernatural Western, which I call John Ford's The Searchers meets Lord of the Rings, called Wisdom. And that's Tom Mandrake on the art. And the fourth one is the closest thing to a traditional superhero story, although when you dive into the story, it's not at all. It's called Anyman. And that's being illustrated by David Baldy, who I worked with a couple of years ago at Marvel on the Ben Reilly miniseries. So we launched all 4 of those. And then toward the end of the campaign, the first campaign, we slipped in a 5th book, which I had floating off in the ethers called The Evergloom Mysteries, illustrated by a wonderful Greek artist named Vasilis Godzilis, who I'd worked with on some projects for IDW. And the campaign went really, really well. And we did a vote at the end. We thought we would throw all these books out there. People would pick one, and we would continue that one, do the next 3 issues of a miniseries, and be done. But we gave people the option of voting for all 4 of the main books. And that's what got the most votes. So here we are now, week 3 of our DeMultiverse Phase II Kickstarter, launching the second chapters of all the books, including the 5th bonus book, Edward Gloom. So here we are. And as we did the first time, we have some wonderful artists doing alternate covers. I'll run these down and then we can relax and talk. So for Godsend, that was an easy one because Matthew Dow Smith, who did the first issue, is now doing the variant cover for the second issue. For Layla in the Lands of After, we have amazing artist, Marguerite Sauvage, just does wonderful, playful fantasy art. She did a great cover. For Wisdom, Pat Zurcher, an artist I've wanted to work with for a long time, did an amazing cover. And what am I missing for Anyman? Derek Robertson, as I always say, Derek Robertson of The Boys fame, you know. So, and our collected edition, as we have the individual books with the variant covers, and they were doing collected editions. First time around, we had Liam Sharp doing the cover for the collected edition. Liam, I don't know, did they do the Eisners last night? Because Liam was nominated for an Eisner this year. I hope he won if they did, or maybe they're tonight. I'm not sure. Anyway, Liam has also done the cover for the second collected edition. So we have just, you know, I always say, put me aside. What an extraordinary group of artists we put together. For their work alone, it's worth the price of admission. And of course, we have all the extras. You know, we have T-shirts and autographed books. And if you want, you can get a Zoom call with me and sit and talk for 40 minutes and about anything you want within reason. And so go to our Kickstarter page, check it out. You know, we want these books to continue. That's the idea, to carry them along. Right. But in order for that to continue, there's a serious investment that went into these books that has to be recouped in order for us to move on. We met our basic funding goal. The basic funding goal was just to guarantee that the books would be printed and get into the hands of the people that are supporting us. But for us to really continue, we need to really get a nice foundation here, because I want to see all these continue. Because even if we finish the initial miniseries, all of these are big stories that I see going on for years. You know, we will tell a complete story in each initial miniseries, but I have so much I want to do with these stories and with these worlds moving forward from here. How was that for the pitch? Was that okay?
That's a fantastic pitch. And as you were saying things, it had questions pop into my mind, because one of them was, how long do you see some of these stories going for? Is it going to be a 4-issue miniseries initially for all of them, and then perhaps go further, or what was the plan for?
Yeah, that was the initial plan, would be to do a 4-issue miniseries for all of them, and then move forward from there. We'll see what our supporters feel when this round is over, because we've discussed, well, maybe what we'll do is do a separate Kickstarter for each of them and do like a 38 or 40 page book to wrap up the first miniseries. You know, right. So it could go a lot of different ways. We could just do a collected edition. Just keep doing collected editions with chapters in that. We could continue doing what we're doing now with the individual issues. There's a lot of ways to go. But, you know, we're so focused right now on getting to the end of this Kickstarter that those are just ideas floating in the ethers at the moment. But the goal is to continue. And like I said, once the initial mini-series are over, there's a lot more story to tell for all of them. We want to tell a complete story in the initial series, but those stories are just the beginning of something epic for all of them.
That's cool. That's very cool. Yeah, it's while I was reading through the first chapter, because I have the graphic novel that collects the first 4 issues of them, and like most of your books and your stories, there's that fascination with the exploration of the uncertainty, you know, space and time, but also the questions. Like each of those books dig into the psyche of, who am I? What is my purpose?
Yes.
What do I believe in?
Yeah.
And where do we go? I don't know.
And also the idea of who we believe we are versus who we really are. Yes. How we perceive reality versus what reality really is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. That's a better way of summing it up, because and it doesn't necessarily go in that order as you read it in the trade, because it starts off with Layla, who that's probably my favorite book. I don't know if it's because it was the first one, but I like there's a whimsicalness about it.
Yes.
The sort of Alice in Wonderland mixed with Wizard of Oz, as you set out in the intro to it. But I really like the mind experiment of the afterlife being that thing that people really invested their lives into living.
We get what we project. So if you believe in a Christian heaven with angels and clouds, that's what you'll get. If you're guilty and think you deserve hell, you'll get that for a while. If heaven to you is being 10 years old again, playing baseball in the street with your friends, that's what you'll get. So that's why it's the lands of after, because the afterlife is not just one thing. It's an infinite number of things depending on the perceptions of the soul that crosses over. Yeah.
So With that said, like I remember reading Brooklyn Dreams from you, and as a
Yeah.
young person, you thought about these kind of ideas quite a bit, observing like your family and the city that you lived in. What
Hmm.
made you want to tell? I guess it's because of the Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz aspect, but you told this story of exploring the afterlife through a child's viewpoint. What made you want to go that route? Was it the that innocence of the Wizard of Oz that just captured your attention?
Yeah, one of the things that sparked the story, well, two things. One is I've always been fascinated since I was a kid, fascinated with death and fascinated with our concepts of what lies beyond,
Right.
And I've always sort of looked askance at these people that write these books where here's the definitive, I had a near death experience, and here is the definitive version of what's waiting on the other side. And I always thought, what it's like this. Imagine if someone from another planet wants to know what life is like on Earth. So first they call you
Hmm.
and you tell
Hmm.
them about your life. And this is what I do. And I get up in the morning and I go to work and I live in this apartment or house or whatever. And I blah, blah, blah. Oh, so that's what life on Earth is. Then they get in touch with someone living in a slum in Mumbai. Oh, that's what life on Earth is. Then you get someone living in a prison in Russia, and oh, that's what. So the idea that any view of what's coming is definitive is as absurd as thinking that one person could give any view of what life on Earth is. So
Right.
that idea always fascinated me. And I've read a lot about this too. And the ideas from my own sort of inner intuition in combination with the things I've read about people's concepts and experiences with the afterlife sort of fed into this. And then the other thing is simply what I talk about in the introduction, which is I love The Wizard of Oz. I loved the movie as a kid. All the Oz books by L. Frank Baum I read to both my kids. I love that world. The thing that always drove me crazy about the movie, even as a kid, is you get to the end and they sort of dismiss the whole thing. Oh, she got hit in the head and she
Yeah,
had a
yeah.
fantasy. Hated that. Just hated that. And so I thought, well, wait a minute. She got smashed in the head. What if that wasn't just some fantasy? What if that was a near-death experience and her soul moved into the afterlife? So
Yeah.
my fascination with all these concepts of the afterlife and my love of the Wizard of Oz brought me to that place. And that's where I ended up with a young protagonist, a little different than Dorothy, I think,
Yeah.
a little more modern. And the story is set. It starts. She's, I think, 13 years old in the 1980s, because my vision, and again, we're projecting way in the future, is to follow Layla through her entire life till she's an old woman, and at different stages of her life to see what her adventures are in the lands of after. So,
That's very
and
cool.
I've had that vision of this story from the very beginning to do it really like three sections from three separate points in her life and death.
So where do we find her now when the story picks up again in the miniseries?
When the story picks up again in the miniseries, they've just discovered that she's not dead. She's in a coma back on Earth. And
Right.
there's a small window for her to get back and get back into her body. So they're heading for this cosmic court where she can plead her case. But along the way, they run into these entities. There in the lower astral, there are these entities that are very attached to life on Earth, and what they want is to get back to Earth and to get back to life. But they've been completely corrupted by their own desire to be alive again. So they're as far from living beings as we can imagine, and they want Layla for some reason. And beyond that, I don't want to say anything about what happens in the second issue. It goes to some interesting places.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, I had a real affection for that character as she was being guided through, and her grandfather, I think it was explaining like this is
Yeah,
how our minds work back on Earth. So when we do so it makes you also as a reader, I mean for myself anyways, contemplate of what am I putting in my mind to project or work towards? What are those
exactly. What
values
reality am I projecting right now?
right
Forgetting
now?
the afterlife. We're doing it now.
Right. Like that's the investment for what is the unknown,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
so I really like that.
Sean and I originally worked together on Dr. Fate at DC back in the late 80s, early 90s. One of my favorite collaborators ever. And he has just gotten better and better over the years. And he's There are other people that could do fantasy, I'm sure, as well as Sean, but there's nobody that can do it better, as far as I'm concerned. He's the top of his game, and he is so perfect. There's a playful, as you said, there's a whimsy to it. Even in the darkest, most serious moments, he brings a sort of lightness, and he can do both. And he reminds me, interestingly, although their styles aren't the same, but there's a quality to his work that reminds me of another of my favorite collaborators, Mike Plug, that I did a Bodazad with in Stardust Kid. He has that same sort of ability to walk that line between whimsy and darkness, and he does it so well here, so well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, all the people that have been casted, I say this oftentimes when I praise like a comic, is the casting of the artist with the writer, knowing who suits which world best, because all of them are very skilled to dabble in. Each of them could draw a Western or vice versa, right? But you casted them all very well, that their strengths are being brought to the forefront, where it makes
Yeah,
what you write mean a little bit more, because McManus on that art that innocence. It's almost like kind of like Mike Rowingo in the way where you'll follow along because it is beautiful and it is dreamy and it is someone like this looks fun, but there's still
yes,
danger that looms around that fun.
yes.
But they suck you in with that art.
Yeah,
You're right
and there's
about
a
that.
beautiful flow to his work as well. I mean, the eye just flows from panel to panel so effortlessly. And that's the key to great comic book storytelling.
Yeah.
And the reader's not supposed to be thinking about that consciously. The art is just supposed to do it subliminally and take you along on that ride.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now with Anyman, it seems like, so this is a story of that wish fulfillment in a way, of everyone could become a superhero if they sign up for it. That Captain America become the hero, but there's a caveat to it. Why don't you kind of explain what the caveat of this relationship with being a superhero is in Anyman?
Okay, so the premise is that, because the story takes place over the course of like 50 years, we keep jumping back and forth in
Right.
time. That sometime in the late 1960s, this portal opened in the middle of Manhattan, and this being came through who claimed to be from an ancient race, prehistorical, like an Atlantis, some magical golden age that existed. But something happened and that civilization fell. And they chose this one being and they sent him through to what is our crisis point to help us to prevent the same thing from happening here. So he becomes the world's first superhero that the media dubs Anyman. So this is a world where he is the only superhero. There's not like a world of a million superheroes flying around.
Mm.
And people, after initial skepticism, take him to heart across the world. Except that what we find out, what we know, what the world doesn't know, and I guess it's okay to give it away. That's the thing. It starts like a very traditional story until we find out what's really going on. Is that Anyman is the creation of a project called Project Vishnu, which is a group of historians, scientists, philosophers from all around the world who are looking for a way to to do exactly what Anyman says he wants to do, to turn the tide and save our civilization from collapse. So they have engineered the concept of this hero down to choosing his features so he appears multiracial, so that different cultures will find him appealing. So, and also what we discover is there's not just one Anyman. They've come up with this Anyman formula, and it will turn. They find the right candidates that are genetic matches for the formula. The trick is that once they inject you with this formula, you will become Anyman, but you'll be dead within a year. So for 50 years, the world thinks it's the same person, but every year there's been a different person who's lived and died as Anyman. And that's all I want to say about it. And then things begin to twist, and then things twist again. And by the end of the second issue, things twist some more. And I'm still, the wonderful thing, we've talked about this in the past, my favorite thing is when my own stories surprise me.
Mm.
And so I'm still thinking about this story, and all of a sudden something comes up and I go, oh, you mean it could be that? Like I thought I knew what was going on, and suddenly something comes up from my unconscious. Oh, it could be that. I didn't realize that. That's so cool. So I love to have tent poles. I want to know where my story is going. But I always want these stories and the characters to come alive and knock those tent poles over and completely surprise me. And that's what's been happening with Anyman. So even once we get that explanation of who and what he really is, that might not be the full truth either.
Mm. Right. I like when you get into that aspect of being surprised by your own stories. It makes me think of the concept of ideas being living beings. Like you allow the muse to take you where you have to go. You've opened yourself up, like I'm ready to create, but you guide me. And
Yeah.
how do you feel? Do you feel that it usually leads you in the right direction when you tell the story that way?
Always, always. I learned that lesson early on, and I've used this metaphor before, but the story is like you're riding this horse and you're saying, okay, I got to go 5 miles straight ahead that way. And you start galloping because you are determined to get that town 5 miles that way. And the horse starts pulling off to the right. No, 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 horse. I want to go that way. No, and it starts pulling off to the right. And you have a choice in that moment. You're either going to force the horse to go where you thought you wanted to go, or let the horse carry you. And every time you let the horse carry you, it will take you to a better place than you ever had in mind. And that's the truth, because it's all happening in an unconscious place. The way I envision it, it's almost like there's a dimension of story out there. And all these stories are floating around, and they're kind of bouncing around looking for the right person to tell them. They might pop by your head, and then the next guy's head, they go, no, I want him. And they filter in through my unconscious and they cook back there. And that's the other thing. I can actually feel stories developing in my unconscious. And I know sometimes my job is not to write, but to walk away and let the story cook back there and trust my unconscious. And then that story then comes out through the filter of your unique personality and experiences. So the same story, if it came out through your filter, would be a very different story, because you've had different experiences, you have different passions, different obsessions, different themes, So that's also what fascinates me, and I've seen it even just in a more practical way, working in comics, when you sit around with a group of guys and you work on a story, and then everyone goes home and writes their chapter, like what we used to do on Spider-Man. And I thought I knew what this story was, and everyone goes home and writes something different because everyone's bringing a different filter to bear on that story. So that moment when you surrender to the unconscious and allow it to have full reign is, for me, the most magical part of the whole process. And then the conscious mind comes back in and starts cleaning things up and getting that sentence just right and finding the pieces that don't quite fit and clicking them together. But the magical part is when that stuff, I've said before when we've spoken that sometimes I just see movies in my head. I don't know where they come from, but I'm laying there in bed and my eyes are closed and it's like, what's this? And I just have to watch and see what it is and do my best to write down after the fact what I've just seen. And I don't know where it comes from or the times I've really, really struggled with a story. I remember years ago, I was working on a movie project and I couldn't get this thing to work. And I decided this one night that I was going to call the producer up and say, look, I can't do this. I can't make it work. I'm done. I was humiliated. I just couldn't get this thing to work. And I went to sleep and I woke up in the morning. Poof, the whole thing was there. I sat down and I wrote the whole treatment that I had to write. Where does that come from? You can call it the unconscious, or is it something beyond the unconscious? And I think it's both, because I think our unconscious is a reflection and is connected to something far bigger than our individual selves.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, especially when an idea does come to you out of nowhere that you don't think. Like when people compliment you, like, wow, that was really good idea. What made you think of that? The truth is, I don't think I did. I just accepted it. Like I just said, oh, that's you're giving that to me to say it. That's it sounds kind of false modesty, but it's really how it feels. Like you can't really take credit for it.
I'll cash the check, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't.
But
it feels like it is. That's the right way to put it. It's a gift. It's a gift, and then you have to get down to work and take that gift and really shape it.
That's the gratitude, right? Showing gratitude for the gift is working with it now.
That's a great way to put it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's beautiful.
You said that you often see movies in your brain or in your sleep. You just close your eyes and you see them, and that's how you kind of described wisdom coming together.
That's exactly what happened with wisdom.
Yeah,
I was
tell us about that.
Literally laying in bed one morning with my eyes closed, and I saw this movie playing in my head. It's like there's a little screen in your imagination, and it was a Western. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me keep watching this. And oh, I see. It's a supernatural Western. Oh, let's watch it. And then run to the computer. And then, of course, I get all these ideas down. And the next thing I know, I'm spending like days and days doing research about the Old West, and it all gets thrown back into the unconscious. And before I knew it, I had a 50-page outline for what a story with like the epic scope of Lord of the Rings, but set in the Old West.
Right.
And it's interesting too, because as I write about in the first collected edition, when I was a kid, Westerns were everywhere. I was, say 8 years old in the early 1960s, and probably 2/3 of the shows on television, and television then was basically 3 networks. 2/3 of the shows were Westerns. You could flip the dial all night long. Half the time at least or more, you're going to be running into Westerns. And it was the era when it was okay to give kids toy guns to play with, so we all strapped on our 6 guns, went outside and shot each other with cap guns, with our Mattel guns, our plastic 6-shooters. And that was a huge part. I was saying to somebody the other day, I was fascinated with the story of the Alamo. For whatever reason, I don't know. And there was this book about the Alamo that I used to get out of the library over and over. And I'd read it, and I'd bring it back to the library, and I'd go back the next week, and I'd get it out again, and I'd read it again. Something about that era was just fascinating. And then as I got older, I didn't really think about Westerns. There's the occasional Western that popped up. Clint, I remember really liking Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. But usually if I saw a Western on TV, I turned the channel because I didn't interest me. And I'm a huge fan of like vintage old radio from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And I was driving in my car one day, and I had Sirius XM. They have an old radio station, and on comes Gunsmoke, which I remembered as a TV show that I didn't particularly care for as a kid. But the radio show was phenomenal. Some of the best radio drama I've ever heard. And I think that put the little seed of Western love, back in my head, and probably started the unconscious process of growing wisdom in the back of my head. It was like, oh, Westerns, yeah, but what can you do with that? How can you turn that? How can you approach it, A, with a modern sensibility, and B, with a fantasy sensibility? And then the story just, like I said, it just appeared in my head full grown one day, and we were off. And then when we were looking for an artist, we ended up with Tom Mandrake, who, Tom is well known for, say, his work on The Spectre, where he does mood and mystery and the supernatural better than anybody. But he's also well known for that miniseries he did at DC called The Kents, which was a great Western. And so to put those two things together, he was the perfect artist for the book.
What I really like about Wisdom was, what impressed me was how specific and yet random this character was. Like, he really lived a very specific life.
Yeah.
That as I'm reading it, I'm like, this seems like such a random set of events that happens to this person, where he's somewhat a well-to-do, almost like a Buddha in a way, where he comes up doing well for himself and then
that's interesting.
Travels on a road.
Right. He grows up in luxury, really, and pampered and indulged by his wealthy father. He wants to be an actor. Does he have the talent for it? Probably not. But his father funds his theater company. He goes on the road, and he does all this, and he meets the woman that will be his wife. And then his father dies, and he has no head for business, and that whole thing collapses, and he goes off on his journey, and he tries all these different things that fail, one after another, and finally the family moves out, out west, and he opens up a newspaper in this town, and that goes south, and then they decide, well, we're going to move on to California now. That's the land of dreams. And he goes back home that night and finds his house is ablaze, and his wife and daughter apparently burned up in the conflagration. And these spectral riders galloping away from the site. And that begins his transformation. And as we see in the second issue, his first transformation, we know in the first issue that by the time, we're jumping through time a lot in this story.
Right.
So we know that he's become some sort of magician, sorcerer, traveling through the West, and there's some darkness out there he has to meet and stop. But we don't quite know how he got there. In the second issue, we learn about his transformation after his wife and daughter died into this kind, gentle man, into one of the most dangerous, murderous gunslingers in the Old West. And eventually we will learn how that transformation, he went from that to this sorcerer who's been tasked with saving the world, essentially.
Yeah, I really liked how he had this journey cross country that informs as a writer, as a performer, as a magician, all these different things that he tries to become to find himself. And it's like, how is this a Western sorcerer cowboy thing? When's that? But it's very specific. And as you're laying out his life history in those little flashback moments, explaining even like his newspaper publishing days, you realize like this is when you said that you saw the movie play out in your head, it really feels like I know this guy and I feel like I have to tell his story. Almost
And
this, yeah,
that's the way it felt for me.
yeah,
It's like he wanted his story told. I could have
yeah,
saved those bits and pieces for later, but I became so engaged with his life and his life story that I had to get that in there, So you really do, him. By the time you get to that end and that fire at the end of the first issue, you know him.
yes. Yeah, there's a specificity to what builds his character that I feel exists in Wisdom a little bit more than in the other books thus far, which is what is kind of sets him apart from what I found. Now, with Eric Smalls, this is another very trippy book. Like you said, the Jack Kirby meets Philip K. Dick meets the Matrix, which is a perfect elevator pitch. And the artwork in that first issue, there's a certain tension to the unknown aspect of what Eric Smalls is dealing with in his head. Why don't you explain a little bit of this trippy concept of Godsend?
So our main character, and again, I talk about these books, and these first issues are just that. It's like watching it. It's like watching the pilot for, say, Lost,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
not knowing all the things that are going to come later. But the writer of the pilot knows all these incredible. So I know that Godsend, although Eric Small is the main character, it's going to spring forth with dozens and dozens of amazing characters and a big epic story as it moves along. So, the pilot episode is to give you a flavor. So we don't know where or when or how this fall of this godlike race at the beginning. And then we move away from that. We spend time with Eric. And Eric, to me, as his name indicates, is sort of the embodiment of, I think many, if not most of us, at least at some point in our lives, encounter that little voice in our head that says, you're small, you're not lovable, you're not worthy, you'll never accomplish anything, you're insecure, all the kind of negative chatter in our heads that conspires to shrink us and make us small. So it was a very, very clear reason why I gave him that name,
Okay.
He's a junior high school teacher. He's got like one friend, and they're both into like fantasy and science fiction and comic books, but that's it. I don't think he's ever been on a date in his life, and he's got this other teacher at work that he has feelings for that he could never express. And suddenly into this world drops this blue-skinned, godlike character, which the media dubs Godsend. And Eric becomes obsessed with Godsend. He spends all his time watching these news reports on TV, gathering everything he can from the internet, from magazines and newspapers, and he's completely, completely obsessed. And at a certain point in the story, his reality and his sense of personal identity gets completely upended, and he discovers this giant half man, half turtle being standing in his living room, who basically has come to say just that. Your concept of who and what you are and what this world is are completely wrong. And what he discovers is, and I guess that's okay to give it away, that he is Godsend. He doesn't know how or why or who or what Godsend really is, but the turtle basically tosses him out the window, and he transforms into Godsend, and that's where the first issue ends. And that's just, the opening shot.
Yes.
And we crack it open a lot more in the second issue, and Scott Koblish, who comes in on the second issue, really kind of brings the Kirby as we explode this thing out a bit more and introduce
Cool.
a number of new characters. But again, those themes that we talked about are very, very, very present in Godsend. This is who I think I am, but who am I really?
Right.
It's been my experience in life, not just for me, but for all of us, that we are so much more than we believe we are. We are so much more than what society makes us think we are, that we really all, each and every one of us, are divine. So this story becomes the metaphor for that, to see the God within all of us, but to literalize it into these God characters. But there's a lot more going on. what this world seems to be versus what we will discover along the way that it is, all very different, and why this is happening. So there's a lot of story to tell, and literally a pantheon of gods to introduce along the way.
That's very cool. I like that kind of stuff. Is there any symbolic significance in him being awakened, or kind of making him realize he is Godsend with the turtle character?
The turtle figure, in Hindu mythology, the turtle figure is the universe sits on the back of this turtle. It's sort of a figure of primal awakening too. So that's where the turtle came from.
I didn't think it was just random or by accident. I said,
no, it wasn't. How about a turtle?
It.
Okay. No, it wasn't.
So I have to ask, and I sometimes listen to conversations and podcasts and different people in the media talk about things like what you're exploring here in Godsend, which is that Philip K. Dick, a lot of the things he does in his writing, or even in The Matrix, is the thoughts on the simulation theory. Where do you stand on things like that, thinking about what reality is? And like you've often told me, when you read Ubik, it made you like go and touch the walls.
Yeah. Just the same way when I was a kid watching The Twilight Zone. I don't know if you remember the famous Twilight Zone episode where the girl rolls through the wall into another dimension, and her parents are desperately trying to find her. My experience, we always get so deep into this stuff.
Yeah.
That simulation, like a computer simulation, no, I don't. That I don't believe. But I do believe what many mystical traditions have been saying since the beginning of time, and which quantum physics also talks about. This is all just energy. We project form and separation onto something that is way beyond form and separation. And so we take on these individualized forms thinking we are this thing, and I'm thinking that you're there, I'm here, this computer is over here. Quantum physics talks about non-locality, that there is no here and there, it's all one. And so does spirituality talk about the fact that there's a great Meher Baba line where he says, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't want to screw it up, you and I are not we, but one. And even this collective term we really has no meaning, because if it's all one, then there is no we. There's only the one. So what do I really believe? I believe that this is an illusion. This is a dream. And we've come into this dream to acknowledge that it's a dream and to find what lies beneath the dream, which in my experience, and I'm only speaking for myself, and people are free to say he's crazy or whatever they want to say, but this has been my experience. The substance and stuff of this dream is that oneness, and that oneness is love. And that love is our human love is a reflection of that, but it's a love that's far bigger than that, and almost the word love doesn't really define it. The word love isn't even big enough, but it's the closest thing we have. So there you go. There's my view. There's my view of the universe in 30 seconds.
No, I like it because, I mean, you explore these deep-seated concepts that people think about, and sometimes they don't feel comfortable to talk about it because they might be embarrassed, or the group of friends that they have might think like, oh, you're all into that woo-woo stuff. But there is that, especially with the advent of technology as we see it happening, where you start to really consider what is consciousness when machines are able to, almost like you're watching the supreme intelligence in a way come alive in real time. So with comic book writers, I say to some of my friends who always kind of not tease me, but I say, I read comic books, and people think like, why don't you read a real novel? Which I do, but it feels like, especially after that initial era of like the Silver Age, where a lot of these things came to be out of the imaginations of Stan, Jack, and Steve, for instance, where it goes next, it feels like comic book writers were tapped into not just pseudoscience, but a lot of the stuff that was kind of explored is coming to be. And you almost feel like, is it the imagination somewhat prophetic, right? Were these guys onto something beyond what we just thought were superhero stories? Like you think of Warlock, for instance, like that's way beyond just your regular comic book storytelling. There's a lot there.
And so much of that grew out of Kirby's imagination, and everyone's been building on Kirby's imagination. And it's kind of what I said before about individual stories. We all have these filters. So you kind of take all the stuff that you've read and it goes into the back of your head. But and I think that the things that we may have talked about this before, the things that we love and respond to, like when I was a kid, I was watching Twilight Zone when I was way too young to be watching Twilight Zone. But my parents, it was okay. They didn't care, you know? And there was something in there that I responded to. And I wrote a whole essay about it on my blog once. It's like, did the Twilight Zone help form my view of the universe? This idea that the universe is alive and we can interact with it and it has things to teach us and show us and we evolve with it? Or was I born with that truth? And the work that we respond to, the reason why I can respond to a Philip K. Dick or a Rod Serling or whatever, is because it resonates with a truth that I already know. And I think a lot of the work that we respond to, the writers, the artists, the musicians that we respond to, is because it touches a place in us where that truth already exists, and it awakens that truth, and we see it reflected in that art. And in whatever small way, I guess I'm trying to do the same thing, send this all out into the universe, and certain people will find their own truth reflected in the work. And of course, to be entertaining and have a good time along the way. You know, it's comics. There's always going to be the slam and bang and the big visuals because that's the fun of it. But these kinds of stories are great for taking the inner universe and reflecting it, you know, literalizing it. You know, that's what Kirby was so great at. Okay, we'll take all this stuff that's in our heads and turn them into gods and play out what's essentially an inner war on an outer battlefield, you know?
Right.
I want to mention, before I forget, mention something important about the DeMultiverse. All the first issues are available as add-ons as part of this Kickstarter. So don't feel like, oh, how am I going to jump in on second issues?
Yeah.
I've never read the first. They're all available. So you can get the first and the second. You could buy the first trade, which has all those, the four main books there. There's a lot of different combinations of ways you can get this, but you won't be left, you know, flailing trying to figure out what's going on, because all those first issues are available as part of the Kickstarter.
Yeah, all of the different tiers are very fan-friendly in regards to keeping you up to speed with what's going on, depending on where you're entering into the DeMultiverse, as it were.
Right, exactly.
After the Kickstarter, because where we record this and when we might post it, the Kickstarter may be done. Is there another place for people to be able to pick up the DeMultiverse books?
They should. First of all, I hope you get this out before the Kickstarter is over.
The plan is to. The plan is to. Yes.
But if not, just go to spellboundcomics.com and they will have all the books there for you to get.
Okay. So if you missed the Kickstarter, if you're listening to this after it's over, we will get it out before, but you can get them on Spellbound. Okay.
Right. But it's at this moment, it's more important for us to get them through the Kickstarter, because 100%. We need to get enough of a groundswell to know that we can move forward from here and continue these books, which I really, really want to do.
Absolutely. Makes sense. Well, wrapping up the talk about the DeMultiverse, you are entering the multiverses of your former characters that you've worked on before. You're revisiting Spider-Man quite a bit in the last couple of years by going into like Ben Reilly's life. Like, what were those untold tales of what happened when, after the Clone Saga? Where did Ben go? What happened with Peter? Where were their psyches at during those times? What was it like to revisit Ben Reilly after so many years and kind of sift your way through his head again?
You know, Ben was a character that I always resonated with. Just loved that character. You know, going along with what we were talking about before about these stories having lives of their own, I think of these characters as people, because as a writer, I get to know them in the most intimate ways. You know, I've said before, I know Peter and Ben better than I know a lot of my friends, because I know every thought in their head, you know? So when I got the call about Ben Reilly, all I had to do was say the words Ben Reilly, and I was like, yes, you know, I'll do it. Because it's like getting together with an old friend. Hey, I haven't seen you in a long time. You want to meet for lunch? Let's sit down. What have you been up to? This is what I've been up to. Now let's tell a story. And that's what it was like working on that first one, the Ben Reilly series, which was just so much fun. And then we did the Lost Hunt, which was about what was going on with Peter in exactly the same time frame when he and Mary Jane had moved out to Portland and he had no powers, which made for a very, very interesting story, and also allowed me to introduce a character I'd been thinking about in the back of my head for quite some time, who opens a whole new door onto Craven's history. So that was a really fascinating story to do. And now we're doing Shadow of the Green Goblin. 4th issue will be out, I think, well, depending on when you're listening to this. This is July 27th as we're talking. It'll be out on Wednesday, I'm pretty sure. And this is a whole different arena to dive into, which is the first month after Uncle Ben died. Peter is in grief. Aunt May is in grief. Peter has determined that now, after what he's gone through with Uncle Ben, he's not going to be wasting these powers. He's going to be a hero. But he's just a 15-year-old kid in way over his head. And that's the thing that fascinates me. You know, when you're a kid reading Spider-Man, he seems so old. When you're an adult writing 15-year-old Peter Parker, you realize this is just a kid. Imagine yourself at 15 going through what Peter is going through. So it's fascinating to explore that. And of course, you know, we have the whole slam and bang going on, but it's really a story about grief. It's about Peter dealing with his grief, Aunt May, I should say both of them not dealing with their grief, and each one trying to prop the other up because they think by not dealing with it, they're going to help the other one. So neither one of them is dealing with their grief about Uncle Ben, not to mention all the guilt Peter has on top of that, not to mention he's out there trying to be a superhero. And then, of course, we take a deep dive at the same time to what was going on in that era with the Osborn family. And my editor, Danny Chasm, turned me on to this old story where it was just a one-shot where Osborn was developing the formula that would eventually be the Goblin formula and experimented on one of his employees and turned him into this character called the Proto-Goblin. So, okay, so what happened with him? So he becomes sort of the main initiating factor in this story for all the action. And a very interesting character that we get to really dive a lot deeper into. And then we look in and you know, the Osborns, there's so much dysfunction. We bring back Harry's mother, who everyone thought was dead. So just to dig your hands into the muck of the dysfunction in that family is amazing. And it's so ripe for story material, you know. And then we also spend time with the Stacy family because this is when Gwen's mom is dying. So Gwen and Captain Stacy dealing with their grief and their loss. So everybody's dealing with grief, everybody's dealing with trauma, everybody's dealing with loss. And of course, it's a superhero story, so people are also punching and hitting each other as well along the way. But I love this little period. I'm always looking for an opportunity to shine a new light on these stories that we think we know so well.
Right.
Because if you can't do that, if you're just regurgitating what came before, then why do it?
Yeah.
You know, you need to bring something new to the table. And when you can't bring something new to the table, then that's not the story to write. And with Shadow of the Green Goblin, I think we're bringing a lot of new stuff to the table. You know, people sometimes refer to these as nostalgia stories because we go back to a period that people, oh, yeah, I remember when I was a kid and I read that or whatever. But if all it is a nostalgia hit, then same thing. I don't want to write it. I want to be able to tell a story that has value and has meaning, you know, that will have lasting impact in some way on the mythos, on Peter and his life. So I'm really, really happy. And we have a wonderful artist named Michael St. Maria who's doing the art, brand new to me. You know, on DeMultiverse, I'm working with all these artists whose work I know pretty well. This is someone who's brand new to me. And he's just doing a wonderful, wonderful job. He delivers action. He delivers all the quiet emotional moments. And I think he's got a great career ahead of him.
Yeah, the art in that book, you can tell that there is more of a heavy feeling in the air. It isn't just your bright, colorful Spider-Man thwipping around the city in action scenes. These are moments where people are going to be sitting around and talking about what they're going through, the reality of their real lives, not just the bam pow of it all. Got to make sure Aunt May gets her pills. And by the way, it was recently mentioned that we had talked about a Spider-Man story in our Mark Miller episode recently, and of course Aunt May is the main plot line to try to retrieve her in her kidnapping. But a couple people in the comments section had mentioned that JMD wrote the greatest Aunt May story of all time, and they should have just left it alone. And it involved Peter and Ben and Mary Jane it was one of those perfectly timed, earned comic book moments where I feel it was the best ending to the Aunt May story. I wish sometimes they would have just left it alone.
Yeah, you know, but here's the truth. It's comics.
It's comics.
And it's a paradox because writing the death of Aunt May, when you write the death of any character, you have to believe it 10,000%. You can't think, oh, someone's going to bring her back later. You have to think, I'm writing the last moments in this person's life and giving it that emotional heft. At the same time, it's comics, and somewhere along the line, you just know. You have to push that out of your head. You know, everyone comes back. The only one who's never come back is Uncle Ben. Once Bucky came back, we knew anyone could come back. And look how well they did it, for that matter.
True.
So, but with Aunt May, she came back really fast. That was my only problem with it. Was like it was like was a year later or something she was alive again. Whereas like when with Craven with Harry Osborn, those deaths lasted for decades.
Right.
And so then when these characters came back, it was a big deal.
Right.
When you do a death and then you turn around and you bring the character back really quick, it just sort of, I think, cheapens the death. At the same time, that story exists. You can pick that story up
Yeah.
now, and the emotional resonance is in that story. And like I said,
Tremendous.
it's comics. I'm sure I brought back characters that other people didn't want. The writer killed them off, and they didn't want them to ever come back, and I brought them back. So it's just the way it goes when you work in a shared universe. You have to
It's
focus
true.
on what you're writing in that moment. You can't be attached to what's going to happen to those characters in the future because they're not yours. They're all of ours. Creatively, they're all of ours. And then just on a practical level, they don't belong to us at all. They
Right.
belong to a corporation, guys,
Right. Right. It's true. Um, Speaking of Ben and Peter, what is the difference between Ben to Peter if he is Peter?
He's Peter who went down a darker road.
Hmm.
Because, if you go back to the Clone Saga, he basically was told that he wasn't who he believed himself to be. So he had talk about Philip K. Dick, right? He had his entire identity stripped away. Everything he believed about himself was a lie. And so he went off on the road to build a life from nothing. So that took him down a darker road. But so the darkness is there. I think, Peter has had his share of trauma, but there's always been a lightness to Peter as well. With Ben, there's a lot more darkness, but at the core is still the same human decency. There's just so far you're going to push him before he goes off. He's not going to go off that deep end. He's not going to take that step over that last line. He will come closer to that line than Peter will, I think. But he will not step over it because that core of Parker decency and compassion is always in there.
When you write him in the view of Ben Reilly isn't the clone.
All right, I forgot. In the Ben Reilly series was written in the period when he thought he was the real guy. So he'd been through this journey where he thought he wasn't, where his whole life was taken away, and then he comes back and he finds out that he is for that period of time until they reverse that.
Right.
And so, what does that do to you?
Right.
Because you come back and Peter and Mary Jane move off to Portland. Everyone thinks that's the real Peter and Mary Jane, so he can't be Peter.
Right.
He can't return to that life. Same thing. So even though he's been on the road trying to create a new life, he comes back. I have my life back, except I don't. So I'm still building from nothing.
Right. And many of his emotions are that it's confusing to say, but in this reality, Peter is the clone. Ben Reilly is the real guy, the one who saw Gwen die and all of those things. That he lived that, but the Peter Parker in this scenario, who's married to Mary Jane, all of his emotions are rooted in what Ben Reilly's life had essentially been, right? As you read it.
Right.
So now you're approaching Spider-Man, and this guy is the real Spider-Man who was sort of that selfish kid who wanted to prove the bullies wrong and become the wrestler. Like, does that inform any of how you approach Ben Reilly? Or do you just say, this is a guy who was gone for 5 years, so I have to pick up the pieces of a guy who was lost? Or do you go back to him? He designed the whole Spider-Man concept. What does that all mean now?
Right. He had all that is true. At the same time, all that was completely smashed into 1,000 pieces.
Right.
And taken away from him. So now he wants to put those pieces back together. And as I said before, the frustration is he really can't, because he can't take the name. He can't take his own name back. He can't be Peter Parker because there's another Peter Parker out there with a pregnant Mary Jane starting a life in Portland. And everyone in his old life thinks that's Peter Parker. And he's this blonde-haired guy named Ben Reilly who happens to look like Peter,
Right.
I think there's a scene in the Ben Reilly series where he runs into Jameson on the street. And Jameson's
Right.
like, Peter, Yeah.
What are you doing?
No, you got the wrong guy. And then Jameson takes a look at it and goes, oh yeah, I can see in his eyes that's not Peter Parker,
Right.
because those experiences have changed him. So it really is, that's what fascinated me about this whole concept from the time Terry Kavanagh pitched it years ago in a Spider-Man meeting, of that Peter turns out to be the clone, and the real Peter is out there somewhere, because it's that theme we've been talking about all along: who I am, who I think I am versus who I really am, what reality is versus what it really is. And that's all there in Ben's world.
Right. No, it's so fun to go back, especially when through the decades you've always heard, the polarizing reactions of the Clone Saga, but deep down people have a real soft spot for these characters and all of the moments that
Yeah.
occurred during that period of time in Spider-Man's life. It was pretty monumental. I mean, you got a lot of story, of course, so not every moment is going to be a highlight, but the highlights were like they stuck with us as readers to the point where we want to know where's Ben's head at
Right.
30 years later.
Right. There were a lot of flaws in the whole Clone Saga thing, not the least of which was that it was dragged on and on and on and on way too long, which was not what the creators intended. But kind of what you're saying, there was so much. You got Ben Reilly out of that. You got Kane out of that. You got some really great story out of that, and some stumbles and missteps. But and I think the people that read that story, right now there's a lot of adults around that read that story when they were 12 or 15 or whatever.
That's right.
And that was their Spider-Man. That was their era. And so many of those stories have come back. So many of those characters have come back. Kane is another one. What a fantastic character. I love the character of Kane. And then one of the things I did in the Ben Reilly series was I brought back this, because there's Peter, there's Ben the clone, there's Kane the clone, and then there was this weird failed clone that they called Spider-Side.
Right.
Who I always thought when we did it back then, I thought, I do not understand this character. I do not like this character. I don't get what it's doing in the story. And so when I did Ben Reilly, I set myself a challenge. I said, take that character that you didn't like and make him compelling. And I hope that I did that, so that now I think Spider-Side is a real three-dimensional character with depth. So what I would love to do, I don't know if Marvel will ever let me do it, is sort of do a Brothers Karamazov, with Peter, Ben, Kane, and Spider-Side, the four of them together in one story, and really explore all of them as brothers
That's interesting.
in the context of a big adventure. The other thing that what we wanted to do back in the day was, I did a mini series called The Lost Years, because Ben was away for 5 years Marvel time, which was more like 20 years that passed from that original Clone Saga. That means there's like 20 years worth of comic book stories that we could tell.
Yes.
So the original idea was Lost Years was just going to be the first of many miniseries exploring what happened to Ben while he was on the road. And I did a couple of shorter stories, one that took place in Italy and one that took place, I think it was actually in Portland, with Ben on the road. But there's so much story there to explore. You could take him anywhere, all over the world, and put him through his paces.
In regards to the characters you've written, which is the character that you look forward to spending time with when you enter back into their mind? Is there one that you're like, I've missed this guy, I can't wait, or this girl?
It's usually when I'm writing it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. When you're working on a story, those characters have to be your favorite characters in that moment. Do I have favorites? Sure. In terms of the Marvel DC characters, yeah, I love Peter. I love Ben. I love Doctor Strange. I love the Silver Surfer. I love Batman and Superman. I love the DC supernatural characters. DC has such a deep bench of supernatural characters. When I was writing Justice League Dark, I was in heaven because I could pull in any character I wanted, whether it's, the Phantom Strange or a Constantine or this one or that one, a Frankenstein, I Vampire, whoever, So yeah, I do have the ones, I would always love to return to Doctor Strange. I would love to return to the Silver Surfer. I'd love to write Swamp Thing, any of these things. There's always, and if there's Marvel characters that I haven't written, when Keith Giffen was still with us, we always talked about me, Keith, and Kevin doing Fantastic Four. I would love to do a Fantastic Four miniseries set in that 60s era,
Yeah, that'd be great.
So that would be a great thing, because it's a nice combination of big cosmic adventure, but there was a lot of humor in those stories. There was always a lot of humor in Fantastic Four, the interactions between the characters. So, and that's the fun of it. Like, I'm doing this Robin Lives series now, and I hadn't done Batman in a while. And it's the same thing as it was with Ben. It's like, oh, Bruce Wayne. No, no, you and I, we haven't seen each other for a while. But I look back, I'm like, I've done a lot of Batman stories in comics and in animation. Between the work in both worlds, I've written a lot of Batman. The very first Batman story I ever wrote was a coloring book.
Wow.
When I first started at DC, like within my first 6 months at the company, I think it was, I wrote a Batman coloring book. So we've come a long way since then. So to return to that universe, and at the same time, I just finished an episode of the new Cape Crusader Amazon series that's coming up. So it's for the second season, so you won't see it for a while. But so all of a sudden, I'm working on Robin Lives. I'm working on this animated thing. So after all these years away, I'm back with Bruce again. But the fun was I never wrote Jason Todd again. So that's the other thing. You get to connect, learn about and connect with it. It's like you meet a new person at a party and you sit down and you start talking and you get to know them and you explore their psyche and they explore yours and then you create this thing. So that's been really, really fun to go to be with Bruce again. Also, Dick Grayson's an important part of this story. And I've only written him a few times over the years. We return to a character that Giffen and I created in my first Dr. Fate miniseries back in the day, Benjamin Stoner, who runs Arkham Asylum. I bring him back for this, and then we get to play with a lot of other Batman villains. And of course, the story, just so if people don't know, we pick up from the famous Death of Jason Todd story that Jim Aparo and Jim Starlin did back in the day. And this is kind of following that path. Well, what if Jason wasn't killed by the Joker? What if he survived that attack? So again, we're dealing with deep trauma here. Jason has watched his mother die. He's almost died at the Joker's hands. What does that do to a kid? He's just a kid. And what does that do to Bruce Wayne when he finally has to step up and look at the fact that he's been continually for years bringing child warriors into his war,
Right.
And he really has to face that and deal with that in this story. And of course, the Joker's out there as a wild card. We know that he'll be back and making trouble. And I sprinkle in several other Batman villains. So it becomes a very, very deep exploration of trauma and grief against the backdrop of all the Gotham City slam and bang that we know and love.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you feel like, I can't believe they haven't done this yet, because there was that time where the readers were to decide the outcome of him and to never really know like what would have happened had he lived through that. Would he just have become the Red Hood anyways because of how immense that trauma would have been? You can't just step out of that thinking like, well, he's Robin, back to the good old fight. Like he's going to have an edge to him now.
Exactly, exactly. And the fun of this, because it's essentially, then it's not labeled in Elseworlds, but it's essentially in Elseworlds. So we don't have to end anywhere in normal continuity.
Perfect.
We can end anywhere we want. And we see by the end, you'll see by the end of this series, where all the characters land is, I think, places that we would not expect.
Do you think that's a more interesting way nowadays to explore these characters that have been around for 85 years and so much of their story has been told and restarted and retold? But when you step back into their history and kind of explore it through a modernized view, or even just tell these untold tales, if you were, that's a fresh way to say, what if this didn't happen? Let's make that, a possible reality.
Right. If it allows you the opportunity to get out that flashlight and get into their heads and find new arenas to explore, absolutely. But I also think you can do that even with 80 years of continuity behind you. There's always something new and some new wrinkle and something else to explore with these characters. The great thing about iconic characters like Batman is that you can't break them, but you can bend them in a lot of directions. If you bend them too far, you'll break them. And those stories when you read them.
Right.
That didn't work. That's not Batman. That's not Superman. That's not Spider-Man. But you can bend them anywhere from, I wrote 7 or 8 episodes of the Batman Brave and the Bold animated series. That was very kid-friendly, had a very sort of slightly campy feel to it, and yet it stayed true to the essence of Batman. And so you have a range from that to Frank Miller, and 1,000 interpretations in between. And as long as you're true to the essence of the character, like, who is Batman? Is he a psychopath? Is he a decent man? Is he a goofy crime fighter? You know what I mean? Is he just a detective in a costume? He's all those things, depending on where you want to put the camera and where you want to focus. But there's an essence of him that always has to remain. And if you stay true to that essence, I think you can interpret these characters many different ways.
You're 100% right. I don't think you can run out of good story to tell if you're sticking to the true tenets of the character. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I thank you so much for giving me your time, all these different
It's
episodes.
great. Yeah, we always end up in interesting places in these conversations, so I
You
look
you
forward to them.
yeah, you've given me good books to read as well. Last time we spoke, I ended up reading Siddhartha and
Oh yeah,
uh
great.
yeah, and I now think of you as the ferryman
Oh,
of for the one that was in that story. When I speak to you, it's like I get to speak to the ferryman. It's an inside thing if you've read that book, Siddhartha.
that's
Um,
great.
I hope all the success for the Kickstarter. We're gonna try
Thank
to
you.
get
And I
this out.
just want to say to anyone out there who's been reading and enjoying my work over the years, this is really one of the single most exciting, creatively exhilarating projects I have ever been involved in 40 plus years doing this. Um, so please come along for the ride. We need that support so that these books can continue. And I think you will enjoy them. If you don't like my work, I can understand why you don't want to support the Kickstarter. I don't understand why you would if you don't like my work. But if you do, come along. And again, there's 5 different books, 5 different genres, 5 different artists. There's kind of, to use the old cliche, there's something for everyone,
No, you're
but
absolutely
it's
right.
true.
It's true.
It's true. So I hope that if you have not jumped onto this train yet, that maybe listening to this will give you the impetus to jump on the DeMultiverse train. And we really truly, every single person that comes along on this ride, we appreciate. Me and my partner David Baldy, from the bottom of our hearts, and all the artists. It means a lot to all of us. So thank you to everyone who supported us, and to everyone who's going to come along from here. All right, that ends the pitch.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you for constantly sharing your stories and not running out of them, right? Sometimes you wonder what people are working on. What happened to that writer? And there's that concept that they aged out, but not in your case. You always have fresh ideas, where you always go back to even characters that you think, what more can they write about that story? And you find a way to do it and explore the different aspects of the psyche, which makes what we read. It doesn't matter if it's Spider-Man or Batman. It's those themes that you really tackle well. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I would really, really like Marvel to give you a chance to write Warlock, just because of the philosophy that
Interesting.
the
I
Eastern philosophy of that
love
character.
Starlin's Warlock stuff back in the day.
It's
That was
brilliant.
the comic that I could give to people that didn't read comics and say, "Hey, read this. I
Right.
think you'll see what comics can do."
Yeah, and I just feel like you would really pick apart that character and all the different Eastern philosophy that kind of goes into it. You'd be just right for it. And Dr. Fate, I don't know what they're doing, but they need to make it a compendium. The stuff that you did on that book, it should be able
Yeah,
to be collected or put out
yeah.
there somewhere. It's a
I
shame
have a
that it isn't.
collected edition that a fan put together and gave me as a gift, sitting
Right?
on my shelf over there. So I would love to see that Dr. Fate stuff collected. Yeah,
It
yeah,
needs to be for sure. Well, thank you so
yeah.
much. All
Thank
the
you.
best to you.
Always a pleasure to talk to you.
And everybody that is listening to the podcast, whether you're watching on YouTube, please give us the rate and subscribe button. Follow the Kickstarter, and don't forget to visit the OmniverseComics.guide website for reading orders, reviews, other podcasts that we've posted, interviews, etc., etc. Thank you so much, Mr. DeMatteis. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.